how a platform can assess its risk of being exploited by terrorists is actually to do a thorough risk assessment, I would say, in the earliest stages of its development, and certainly prior to its sort of wide general release.
Welcome to today's episode of the Tech Terror Takedown podcast, in which we discuss extremist and terrorist exploitation of the internet. I'm Sophia, Rothut researcher at LMU Munich, and today we're diving into the complex and critical issue of terrorist activities in the digital space to explore which platforms violent extremist and terrorist actors turn to, which challenges arise for platforms, and how to mitigate them. We are joined by a distinguished expert in the field of online radicalisation, violent extremism and terrorism, Professor Maura Conway. Maura holds the Paddy Moriarty Professorship of Government and International Studies at Dublin City University and is a professor of cyber threats in Sidetrack at Swansea University. She was the originator of the Voxpol network focusing on violent online political extremism and is actively involved in the EU-funded Tech Against Terrorism Europe project. It's an honor to have her here with us today to share her insights on the terrorist online ecosystem and the risks to platforms. Maura, let's have a look at the current online landscape. Which platforms are most commonly exploited by terrorist groups?
Thanks for having me, Sophia. I'm happy to have a chat with you about this topic. In terms of the current situation, so what are the most exploited platforms at the present time? I guess I would say in terms of a general overview statement, if you like, that really many platforms, big and small, are currently exploited for terrorist purposes. In our Tate research that you and I and colleagues are currently involved in, we've identified over 100 platforms in the last 6 months that are hosting specifically terrorist content. So content that would fall into the terrorism definition that appears in the EU's terrorist content online regulation. And if we go back further, say if we look at data that we've collected over a year or more, then we're talking about 200 plus platforms that have been utilized. So yes, quite a lot of platforms are currently being exploited for terrorism related purposes.
Very insightful. Expanding on that, what key features or characteristics make online platforms especially attractive to terrorist groups?
I guess what I would say is that platforms that have very large numbers of users, what's called in the Digital Services Act, VLOPs, very large online platforms, are still very attractive to violent extremists and terrorism related actors, precisely because of these really large numbers of users that they can potentially have access to if they're allowed to operate on these platforms. And that's why they're always seeking ways to precisely operate on those platforms. But many of those larger platforms have taken quite a lot of steps to make it quite difficult for this to happen. So really their heyday on those platforms was some time ago, now back in the 2010s, and it's much more difficult to operate freely. Violent extremists and people associated with terrorism still continue to seek to get back on those platforms, though, precisely because of those massive user bases. So that's number one. I would say a second type of platform that is attractive from an extremism and terrorism perspective are those platforms that have little to no content moderation. And so then it's obvious enough their content doesn't get scrutinized, it doesn't get taken down, and then they're still fairly free to act on those types of platforms. And I would say thirdly, platforms where users retain more control than the operators of the service, if you like. So any kind of distributed service where really all of the, or really a large part of the control remains with the user. So that's in a kind of general kind of way. I guess if I was going to get specific, I would say something like, okay, Telegram is probably still the most active space when it comes to a relatively well-known platform with a large user base that hosts easily accessible terrorism content. And that's true across the ideological spectrum. So everything from jihadi terrorism content, including so-called Islamic State content and what have you on one hand, to extreme right content, including footage that was taken by perpetrators during an attack or what have you. So across the ideological spectrum, it's probably still the most used platform. I guess messaging applications are also being widely used at the present time. One of the reasons for that is definitely that we've seen a shift, amongst a lot of users over the last number of years from more traditional social media to messaging applications, and so this is reflected in the extremism and terrorism scenes also. Especially when it comes to jihadist content, file sharing sites are super important. They're using those to ensure that archives of their material are still accessible. They're using them then to sort of populate other platforms when they have the opportunity to do so, and whatnot. And I would say lastly, in this respect, not to forget also websites. Websites are also quite an important factor. They always have been quite popular and important when it comes to extreme right online activity. But I would say that they're increasingly important when it comes to violent jihadist activity, also more broadly what you might term Islamist activity. I'm talking about Hamas websites, Hezbollah websites, that sort of thing also.
To what extent do terrorists use smaller platforms already?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I guess I would say I would come back to you with a sort of a question or raise another question, which is, what makes a platform large or small? Is it the number of users, the number of employees, some combination of those? I've already mentioned Telegram, and it's an interesting one to look at as an example. It's a very large platform based on user numbers, but not actually if we're measuring based on number of employees. But in general, I guess what I would say is that there's a sort of power law distribution in play here. What I mean by that is there's a small number of platforms out of that 200 plus that I referred to earlier that we found in our data gathering. There's a very small number of those that are heavily used for terrorist content hosting purposes. And then there's a very long tail, I would say probably 190, maybe even more, that host a very small number of pieces of terrorist content. So they'd have very few items of terrorist content, most of the platforms. And many of those in the long tail are small and micro platforms. So they're pretty obscure. They're not well known. They have relatively small numbers of users. They've relatively small numbers of employees. In fact, I would probably hypothesize that many of them are sort of one-man operations. So yeah. I mean, to what extent do terrorists use small platforms? They use them. They test them out, I would say, quite a lot. They tend to gravitate towards a relatively small number of platforms, but if you look across the board, you'll see that in that very long tail of platforms, it's mostly populated by small and micro platforms.
All right, drawing on that, are smaller platforms inherently more vulnerable to be exploited by terrorist actors than their larger counterparts?
Yeah, I would say that they are. That's for a number of different reasons, but I mean, two of them I would say are pretty clear. So, many small platforms I would say really don't have sufficient knowledge of online extremism and terrorism and what's happening in that whole online scene. So that's one thing. So they're ill prepared in that respect because they just don't have a good handle on that to begin with. But also because they are small and micro operations, like I say, many of them I would assume are sort of one-man shows, like I say. Well then, in that case, they also just don't have the capacity. Even if they do have an awareness of what might be going on, they have very little capacity to actually react effectively. And there is a third aspect here, which is that it has to be said that some small and micro platforms either take a very sort of black and white position on speech. In other words, they are a very libertarian, if you like, in their attitudes to speech, so that they say they have a commitment to free speech, and for that reason they're not interested ideologically in doing content moderation. But also there are some other instances where the people who or person who has actually stood up the site or the online service or what have you is a sympathizer to some ideology associated with terrorism or what have you. So that's a couple of other reasons why you couldn't then call them they're not being exploited by terrorists. They've actually been sort of stood up by people who are sympathetic to them. But mostly these sites are exploited by terrorists precisely because they're small. Precisely because they realize that there is no capacity for content moderation, and so they're relatively free to act.
That brings us to an important point about self-assessment for platforms. How can platforms, particularly smaller ones, assess their risk of being exploited by terrorists?
Yeah. I mean, I would say to begin with that just about any online space is at risk of being exploited for terrorism related purposes. So that's an important first point to be made. How a platform can assess its risk of being exploited by terrorists is actually to do a thorough risk assessment, I would say, in the earliest stages of its development, and certainly prior to its sort of wide general release, if you like. Unfortunately, this seems still often not to happen, which at this point, given what we know about potential online harms, not just in the extremism and terrorism space, but, more broadly in hate, misinformation and disinformation, online child sex abuse, etc. So not doing a thorough assessment about risks and potential harms and what have you prior to wide general release of some service or whatnot, I think is very irresponsible, to be honest with you, at this point.
Considering the risk you've outlined, what proactive measures, what best practices can platforms adopt to prevent extremist and terrorist activities and to bolster their security frameworks?
Yeah, that's a good question, Sophia. I think, number one, they can brush up on their knowledge of the nature and the workings of online extremism and terrorism. So really educate themselves about, what constitutes terrorist content, what certainly their legal responsibilities are, what regulations apply to them, etc. I think certainly services like Tech Against Terrorism and projects like Tech Against Terrorism Europe can definitely assist them in that respect, which is positive. Number two, I guess I would say, is they really should routinely seek to identify the types of content, the types of potentially harmful content that is on their platforms, including extremist and terrorist content. They can do that either, manually or semi-automatedly. And so take a 360-degree, a holistic view of their platform, keep an eye on what's happening there, and obviously, especially, keep an eye out for a content that falls into the terrorism category, and that they have, legal responsibilities in respect of. And then I guess I would say finally, number 3, that if they find terrorist content on their platform, that they respond swiftly. And in that way, they're making it clear to users that are uploading that content or that are also seeking out that kind of content that their platform isn't a hospitable place for that. And that, if they continue to, upload that content and whatnot, that it will be taken down swiftly, and that it just won't be tolerated, I guess. And so, those are sort of 3 pretty sort of broad-based, but 3 important things I think it is to, that they should do.
Thank you so much, Maura. It's been a privilege to have you with us today, sharing your expertise and insights into the complexities of the terrorist online ecosystem. Your work is crucial in guiding platforms on how to better safeguard their environments against terrorist misuse. So, dear listeners, stay tuned for more coming up from Maura and her team. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you for staying informed about the complexities of today's digital landscape in light of violent extremism and terrorism. I look forward to welcoming you back in the next episode.